Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be discussing the future of UN peacekeeping missions in Africa. I am joined by a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Tchie. Andrew is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Buckingham, amongst other roles that is involved in. Andrew, I'm very delighted to have you join me today. I know we've had some back and forth in terms of the timing and date, but I'm glad we finally have you on board there. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let me start off. There's this perception, I don't know if you agree with it, that the foreign military intervention under the UN nations in Africa has failed or is failing. And if you agree with that perception, why? What are the factors that have contributed to that? But if you don't, then why?
I mean, I think it's a controversial point. So let me start by saying I think in all cases there are challenges, and those challenges persist partly because of the nature of those conflicts. One, the evolution and nature in terms of the dynamics, but also the actors. But also, I would say the situation has become very much more politicized than it was in the 90s, or even for that sake, when UN peacekeeping operations were first thought of or designed. And so in any of the research that I've done, what we try to do is maintain a balance between fair criticism, but also the nature of what UN is trying to respond to. And so to answer your question, yes, to some degree, you can argue some missions haven't been as effective as would have hoped. But I think over time, what we have seen is that many of those missions have become or have tried to reach their ultimate abilities by trying to be more effective over time. And so with any mission, there's always going to be challenges and whatnot that start. But if you add that or add in addition to that challenge, then you have things like intervening factors, like, for example, mis and disinformation, or, for example, an election. All of these things have a ramification on how the UN positions itself, but also more widely how the peacekeeping operation responds. And so to answer your question, as I'm trying to do, as you can tell, it's not an easy answer. And in essence, it is a mixed result, I would suggest. On one hand, where you can see that in the early 90s, particularly, there were some challenges. In the early 2000s, particularly when people like Kofi Annan were at the helm, there were UN peacekeeping missions that were successful. But largely speaking, where we are now, they have large amounts of challenges. One around, again, as I said, logistics, support, all of that other aspect. The mandates also being more extensive than they were in the 90s. So all of these are additional factors that I think it would be unfair to just sort of say, okay, actually, that's it. And I think what we are observing, which is clear, is more of a decline in the use of UN peacekeeping operations.
Interesting. I had for one of the episodes we had Shedrick Conan come, and he also did made a distinction between the 90s, UN Peacekeeping in the 90s, and the late or the recent. And one interesting thing he said was, whereas in the 90s there was the willingness to use more political solutions, political,
Yeah.
diplomatic solutions.
Mhm.
But whereas now we'll see less of that, and there's this need for stabilization. Whereas there's less use of diplomatic channels or diplomacy, and more kind of like forces. But I don't know if you can expand on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I concur with those findings, and that's similar to what I've done in my own research. So one thing that we are seeing is that we are seeing political missions, or as it were, more diplomatic efforts were there in the 90s. Long term, oftentimes long types of mediation efforts where you'd maybe have UN, AU actors, oftentimes trying to deal with more peace building or from a peace building mediation perspective. And so
Mm,
you had more Western involvement, as it were, but more long-term engagement. Oftentimes now in the African continent case, what you then tend to happen is you have some mediation, some talks in the background, but to
mm,
sustain that and to sustain the cost of that, oftentimes is a challenge for institutions like the AU and regional bodies because it costs money to send an envoy back and forth. If you just take the situation of Mali when you had the former president Goodluck Jonathan going back and forth on a jet to engage, these things are costly. Yeah,
mm,
so it's all of these costs and what come with it and the negotiations back and forth that I think in the 90s we were more willing to invest in that side, i.e., the prevention side of things. And this
mm,
speaks widely to conversations around the APSA, and this is African Peace and Security Architecture, which is
mm,
really designed to prevent conflict, versus now actually the security options being, as it were, the only alternatives that people try to or tend to rely on, largely
mm,
because of the framing around the war on terror, terrorism, and insurgencies, that governments tend to focus more on this as opposed to let's engage with these people in conversation. So, if you were to look back at the 80s and 90s, you will see more negotiations that took place,
mm,
partly, particularly in the 90s after South Africa sort of transitioned. You see the South African diplomatic corps coming out, or Ghana doing more diplomacy, Nigeria doing
mm,
more of this. That
mm,
has all changed now. Yeah, and oftentimes, what you see is the first response being, okay, we try some diplomatic stuff, it all hasn't worked, security. And so, what we have been arguing for in our research is a more broader approach, which again learns some of the lessons, but is more adaptive to the context and to the situation. Why? One, as I said, the evolution of conflicts is constantly changing and evolving. Two,
mm,
the context in which you're operating will constantly change. Dynamics are and borders are not as defined as they once were in the 90s. People are moving in and out, migrations, all of these other things, the impact
mm,
of climate change. All of this means that you have to take an adaptive approach to the
mm,
situation. And what that means is that the route to A to B might not be as simple as A to B. It might be
mm,
A1, A2, A3 before you then get to B.
mm,
And so that understanding is crucial and important to how we respond to conflict. And so if you take that sort of situation, that scenario that we're in the African continent, then
mm,
you look at the way in which UN peacekeeping was designed or has evolved to where it is now. That is largely supposed to do with two actors. One actor on one side might be the state, who is
mm,
an actor that comes to some sort of agreement. On the other actor, you have the what's it called, the insurgents, or the what's it called, the opposition groups, who has a political motive. They
mm,
agree, and then UN peacekeeping deployed to keep the peace. We're no
mm,
longer having those situations. What we have now is situations where you have to deploy where the other side doesn't want to negotiate.
mm,
And so that requires a level of force, but that also requires a more adaptive and more whole approach to dealing and tackling that issue,
mm.
largely because you're
Very
dealing with people and whatnot.
very interesting. It does say, but even if you look at it, like from the 90s till now, there's always been interest. So maybe it's a lot more dynamic now, like you've pointed out. There's climate change. There's some of migration patterns that kind of like complicate things. But then there's cost as well. But again, those interests have always been there. We could see you pointed the war on terror, and then we're seeing in these places. But I wanted to talk about the interest of not just because you have several intervening states, isn't it, in the UN missions? You have several states contributing to these missions, and each of these states we have their interest. Maybe America would have like maybe terror security, whether the EU would be like migration or to stem all of
Mm.
that. But we've been seeing as well where let's go to DRC for instance. I've read somewhere where MONUSCO they seems to be the longest UN peacekeeping mission, but it's one that is being accused of so many things, including the mission itself or having a vested interest in some of
Mm.
the regional dynamics in that region.
I mean, I couldn't speak to the interest of the UN
Oh,
in terms of the regional dynamics. What I would say with that situation is, I think what is evident from both sides, as in the government side, and I don't speak for the government, I don't speak for the UN in this case, but one
mm,
thing that what I observe is that oftentimes with the government, whether it's um, Joseph Kabila or Tshisekedi that you have now, everybody
mm,
has used the anti sort of UN when it suits them. Yeah, so that
mm,
is a problem, and I
mm,
think UN missions have always had to deal with that, particularly in the case of DRC, early 2000s, 2010s elections to where we are now. There's always a need to blame somebody else or point the other direction. Why? Oftentimes because it's a lack of leadership.
mm,
Oftentimes because ultimately, if the government wants to deal with that situation, they would deal with the situation. And I think one thing, and that's why I sort of alluded to in my question, I think
mm,
we are also at the point where in the continent where we now have to say, actually, these interventions, okay, they are here designed short term to support, but we now need to be looking internally to say, actually, we need to rethink how we mediate, how we deal with these situations,
mm,
how we bring parties together, but ultimately how we govern and the leadership that governs our people. And I
mm,
think really it's down to voters, but also the wider continent, young people, to actually say, okay, are these the right people that we want in power? Yeah.
mm,
And if they're not the right people, who are those people that we need to look for as advocates or voices that can bring about that change? Because in most cases that you see, most of these armed groups don't emerge for no reason. They emerge from challenges and issues,
mm,
whether it's
mm,
be the fact that you have a difference between the center and the peripheries, or between economic development in those areas, or no jobs, no hope, whatever, or the state repression, whatever have you. You can name it,
mm,
and if you look back in
mm,
history, you see that. And so I think, like I said, there is a wider conversation here to say, actually, if we keep on going and relying on interventions, and again, I'm not saying interventions are wrong, I'm saying more broadly speaking, we also
mm,
need the African continent now to get grip and grapple with some of this. And I think we are seeing that from the security side. We're seeing more
mm,
African regional organizations come together and deploying to deal with this situation. But again,
mm,
the focus has been on security only and not
mm,
more broader aspects, like, for example, politically engaging long
mm,
term,
mm,
politically engaging in mediation efforts, engaging in humanitarian relief, all of these things that are important for those people who take up arms. So I think a
mm,
more broader aspect is important. And so, to your point on DRC, I think there is where the balance needs to be struck. It's all good blaming the UN, so they haven't done that. Yeah, even if they
mm,
haven't and they pulled out tomorrow, the
mm,
reality is the DRC would have to deal with its own security issues. Does it have the capacity? I don't think so. Two, even
mm,
if it does have the capacity, is it willing to agree and negotiate with all of those 130? I think the last estimate was 130 odd groups, not terrorist groups,
mm,
but groups in that region, and that's just in
mm,
the Cuba areas. Does it
mm,
have the capacity to deal with it? And that's another. Is it really willing to develop the area? And
mm,
those are questions I think we need to ask more broadly, as
mm,
opposed to saying that the UN peacekeeping is the easiest option to
mm,
sort of
mm,
slate. And then
mm,
again, I'm
mm,
not diverting or
mm,
speaking for
mm,
the UN. I'm saying, well, a more broader aspect is important, because even if
mm.
these UN missions are not deployed, you would still have that security issue.
I agree with you, to be honest. I agree with you on the complexity of the whole situation. But before I come to the African layer and the political, let me talk about the populace, because you mentioned the youth, the population. So I had one of the, I can't remember now, I think it was an article that I reviewed. And I was surprised to see where the author has taken a survey and people, it wasn't not in Nigeria, and where they're saying, oh, we're Boko Haram, we need the UN. And a lot of time we forget that the UN missions are often one they need to be invited either by the government or whatever to come to these places. And people say at this point we need the UN to come and intervene. But now if I look at what's going on in the Sahel, and look at the population and look at the science, the population often express their frustration or whatever through maybe such kind of like protest, but how they are then channeled or how they become effective, because then again you see some of these elites take advantage, like in the side you see the military, or you see the Russian wagner, you see all of that. And then you see the Arab Spring as well, where it's led to. So how does the population, I think I have an idea in my head, but I want to get your perspective. How can the population itself be effective, the people, knowing that, oh, how can they be effective in choosing the right leader, in demanding what is right, and effecting that kind of change? How can they do it?
Well, I think one is dialogue. That's the main thing for me. That's a really crucial point. Who are we dialoguing with in terms of the leadership? Are we conveying and putting forward our points? And
Mm,
in what manner? And what are our expectations of those through that dialogue? Second thing is the leadership. Who are those in charge? Who are they
mm,
part of? Where did they go to school? All of these background questions are crucial and
mm,
important,
mm,
because if they come from a nepotism system or a part of the elites, that's the question that I would be asking. Is that person the right person that's going to look after my interests? Now, everyone will have an interest, but it's important that you're able to, again, not just nudge, but also allow those people to lead in the direction that works for you as a young person. The third
mm,
point would really be, what do they stand for? What are their morals? How do they represent the people that, or the area that they come from, as an MP, as a local constituent? How do they resonate and talk to you and your issues? And I'm not
mm,
just talking about from a Western perspective, and then you talk about even in an African context,
mm,
really digging deep and saying, okay, but what do you stand for? What is your, on the first 100 days, what are you going to deliver? How are you going to
mm,
deliver? If there's issues around economic reconstruction, actually ask them, are you the right person for the job? Who are you going to put in those
mm,
various ministries if you do
mm,
come to power? So I think we need to be more forward in terms of those questions and asking. But also, I think it's also important, I think, looking at Senegal as an example, particularly because of what they've just come up through, it's also
mm,
important to re-empower some of the young people to also lead. I think that's
mm,
important.
mm,
There are
mm,
many young people who are, I would say, more than capable of leading the way forward in terms of, you know, out the box thinking, innovation, creativity,
mm,
about how you bring in fintech and all these other aspects to the African continent. And I think there's so much there that can be done. I think the other aspect really is about, once these people are in power, what are the institutions and mechanisms that we want to empower to ensure that they're held accountable? And what I mean by empower is, some of the African institutions that we have are either weak or are growing. And so, really, what it's then about is, how do we build the capacity of these institutions to hold these leaders accountable, so that when they fall in line or offline, or should I say out of line,
mm,
for a better word, then we can hold them accountable for the issues. And that, for me, that is the most important thing. What we can't have is a situation where we continue to talk about corruption and all these other issues.
mm,
We know that
mm,
it exists in everywhere around the world. But now, I think in the African context, we need to look beyond that now and say, okay, what institutions do we want that can hold these people accountable? Beyond that, then, it's then about the focus. Then the focus then shifts away from just purely the leader to the institutions that serve my needs, your needs, everybody else's needs, as opposed to the institution that serves the leaders' needs. And I think we've spent the last 20, 30 years building up leaders in Africa, which has been good in some respects, but hasn't
mm,
been the leadership that we need to move the continent forward.
mm,
One that unites Africa, two that really, ignites this new thinking around Pan Africanism and what that means
mm,
for
mm,
us as a new generation, but also
mm,
three, liberates the African continent from the economic challenges and problems it has. Why is it
mm,
that in this day and age, when everyone is moving to green technologies and we have all of the raw materials, that we are not benefiting from that? One
mm,
aspect is the climate change aspect. Okay, fine, we can ask for reparations for all of that stuff, but why are we not really tapping into that technology ourselves?
mm.
And I think that is the question for me that I would be asking and saying, okay, really, how do we empower our institutions to be able to deliver that sort of prosperity for Africa?
Mm. No, I think I agree with you as well, and I think that mirrors what I'm doing currently in my research, looking at uh, relationship between. So what you call an institution, I'm looking at our system. in what the system that brings the same leaders needs to be questioned. What system allows the election of maybe it's a system that supports corruption, a system that supports that kind of stuff. I think I agree with you on that, but I'm looking at it within the relationship between our adoption of maybe liberal democracy, or if we have to start looking at what sort of system works for the continent. But let me go to the African led. I'm glad you say sometimes we spotlight the UN missions, but we've also talked about the African led or African support peacekeeping mission. We saw one in was it Somalia now? I think that there was an African led one in Somalia. How is that? Is that an alternative to the UN peacekeeping mission, or is that in a supportive way, and how effective has it been, or ineffective?
I wouldn't say it's an alternative. I would say it's an evolution to the responses and those challenges that existed, as I mentioned before.
Mm,
So if you think about it in the African Union's terms or AU's terms, and I'll use the acronym AU going forward,
mm,
the AU sees a mission like Somalia as an African-led peace support operation. And peace support operation, as the definition is quite different, and Decoding and
mm,
others have written quite extensively about that. Again, one UN peacekeeping, holding or keeping peace where there is peace to be kept. We have a peace
mm,
agreement they hold,
mm,
and they agree. Where the African peace support operations are supporting peace, oftentimes focus on the state, i.e.,
mm,
a country's in trouble. We need to stabilize the country. We deploy a peace support operation to create environment or room for stability. So those
mm,
concepts are different. One in the UN terms would be classified as enforcement. In the AU's
mm,
terms, it's peace and support operations. And so what we have seen is in situations where a state is in crisis
mm,
or there are challenges in a particular region, the African Union and others, and when I mean others, I'm talking about the regional economic communities. So in this case, ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD,
mm,
Northeast, South, Central, have deployed their what has largely been classified as peace support operations or African-led peace support operations
mm, mm,
to deal with these situations. Oftentimes using one of the pillars of the APSA, in this case, the African Standby Force, and
mm,
institutional mechanisms to deploy those forces. And oftentimes, again, focus on hard security or medium time or medium type security to sort of counterterrorism approaches. And
mm,
these deployments are oftentimes, again, designed to support the state put back onto a path of stability. So if you look
mm,
at the East African force that was deployed recently to the Eastern DRC, that was made up of the regional forces from that area or two
mm,
contributing countries who deployed to Eastern DRC to, as it were, deal with the security issues that were emerging from the Eastern DRC. The
mm,
recent deployment of South African forces from SADC, which is the Southern uh, South African regional bloc under Rex, to Mozambique is an example of another REC being deployed.
mm,
And then you have the other type, which again are where you have one or two countries that cross over regional mechanisms, and in this case, economic community mechanisms, and
mm,
they form coalitions. So, for example, the one that is oftentimes used is the multinational joint task force
yeah, mm.
in West
Lake
Africa, but
Chad.
that also the Lake Chad Basin that also covers Chad, obviously. The G5 Sahel is another one, and then
Mm,
you had the one in to deal with the LRA in sort of Sudan, South Sudan. And this was to obviously deal with George Coney. Not George Coney. Yeah, to deal with the situation there, the
mm,
LRA, and then you have the sort of Accra initiative, which is a semi ASI or ad hoc security initiative, which really hasn't been upscaled to the way it needs to be, partly because of mandates and whatnot. But
mm,
these alternative initiatives, what they're designed to do is deal with cross-border issues. So the idea is you have a group like Boko Haram who are going across different border ports. And
mm,
because UN peacekeeping and African-led peace support operations are to deal with the whole state only, they don't
mm,
have the power to go into another state and pursue
mm,
those terrorists. Yeah.
mm,
And so these mechanisms are designed to go across border. And so that's what you are seeing emerging. More of these mechanisms, or you might have bilateral agreements where a state, for example, Rwanda, might have a bilateral agreement with Benin or with Mozambique to deploy, oftentimes to push these forces or to push terrorists away from particular areas, or to clear the way for another regional grouping to come in and deal with the situation. And so that's where we are with that aspect in terms of security deployments. Which again, if you look at the UN's mandate and its sort of its doctrine, it's not allowed to do that. It's not allowed to cross over 2 or 3 states. An African-led peace support operation is not allowed to do that, particularly in the AU context, because it's designed to deal with the state, a state only. And so these ad hoc security initiatives are crossing borders because one, they're communicating, they're coordinating on the operations. But again, they also have the same challenges that I mentioned before. They're very much security focused. They very much lack the civilian dimensional aspect. There's very much little space for mediation and other stuff. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not as extensive as one would have hoped, particularly if you look at the efforts that were done in the 80s and 90s, particularly around mediation and whatnot. And so, what again, going back to that point about the adaptive stabilization, we are arguing for a more holistic approach that captures all of these aspects. If you look at the coups that took place in West Africa, what are some of the indicators? Because by all accounts, Mali 5-10 years ago was doing well. Not 5 years, but maybe 10-15 years
10
ago
years, yeah.
was on the good road to democracy. That was what people were saying. So what went wrong? So actually, for us, it's moving away from the current indicators to say, actually, let's look at this thing in more broader aspect, where humanitarians, those in stabilization, those doing mediation, those doing security, everyone comes together to form one form of a political doctrine or political, as it were, mandate to support the state moving forward, or support the region or the areas coming forward who are affected. And so that's really what we're seeing now. That phenomenon is something I wouldn't say new. It's new in the sense that it's crossing borders. It's not new in the sense that we've had coalitions of the willing. So if you think of ECOMOG, Liberia, Sierra Leone, these were all coalitions of the willing that you saw in the 90s. The difference being is they couldn't cross border. They couldn't cross each other's borders, but now they can do that through these ad hoc security initiatives.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I think I can see where when they say African, the term where they say African solutions for African problem, and then where Africa is beginning to take the forefront in terms of solving these issues. But then again, like you rightly pointed out, we tend to see the same problem we see with the UN mission is what we see. So you see, for instance, with Mozambique. So we've got an episode that is going to air next week. So we had someone comment and we talk about whereas where Rwandan forces have been effective to some extent in some areas, the SODOC itself, the region is not looked at in that way. They are seen to they seem to have frosty relationship with the civilians that they've come to protect. They've been accused of certain stuff. And then again, there's also interest. So you look at Rwanda, for instance, where Rwanda is part of the group in DRC. And Rwanda is also accused of supporting the M23 rebel groups, and and everyone has interest. So we kind of like see the same issue, whether it's an African-led or UN-led issue. They see in the Sahel as well. You're seeing with ECOWAS, and ECOWAS not being able to firmly wading into the coup plotters in Niger, Burkina Faso, and all of that. So I agree with you that we need a much broader, holistic approach. But with Russia coming to the picture, another coming to this picture, how do you see that moving forward? Do you see, does that complicate the whole situation, or does that?
Look, I mean, there have always been mercenaries in Africa. Let's be honest, and this is something that I've spoken about publicly, and many will probably hate me for saying this. Look, there have always been mercenaries from all sides, and let's be very candid and honest. I'm not a pro-Russia person, and I'm not going to stand here and advocate for Africa, for Russia here. But I think what I'm not, I think, too happy about is the over focus on Russia, particularly the Wagner group, because I think what it does is it detracts from the issues. It detracts from what is going on, why it's happening, and why those states are looking towards that model. There is a problem. And if a state has to hire a mercenary, it means it's desperate. It means that things have not gone right. And then we need to question why. Why did that operation the French operation that was there for X amount of years didn't work the way it needed to.
mm,
Why was it ineffective? Yeah. Yes, there were
mm,
parts when it was, there were parts where they had challenges. But more broadly, we need to ask these questions instead of saying, well, they're going to Wagner. Because for me, that's an unhealthy conversation. And
mm,
again, even if you look at it, a lot of it is Wagner in Africa. And that tells you how I would say, for the most part, and I would even probably push and say, very unaware people are of the African continent. There are 55 African countries by the AU standard, 54 if you want to
mm,
count the other
mm,
method. Wagner can't be in every country. If there's an estimated 18 to 20,000 of them, and most of them on the border of Ukraine, they can't be in everywhere in Africa. So
mm,
again, that use of the term, and again, I'm not advocating for Russia here. What I'm
mm,
saying to you is, unless we have these nuanced conversations, then we miss the challenges. We miss why people are looking there.
mm,
Because again, if there are 18,000 and 15,000 across the Ukrainian border, that means there's only 3,000, maybe 5,000 across Africa. They're not
mm,
all across every African continent,
mm,
every African country. So again, why am I saying this? It's important because if we misrepresent the context, then we've misunderstood the reasons and the thinking behind why states, but also those in power make decisions that they do. And that is
mm,
crucial because if we're going to re-engage and the way we re-engage, that's important. So that's the first aspect. The second
mm,
aspect for me is again, it's really about that broader aspect. Once we figure out and understand why it has gone wrong in the Sahel, why ECOWAS hasn't been as credible. I mean, we recently visited the Gambia, and we're hopefully producing a report and a paper on the Gambia, and we understand why the AU and ECOWAS couldn't intervene in the Gambia. We understood
mm.
why Seto. These are smaller states. Yeah. It was different in the 90s where you had an all out sort of war,
Wow.
different situation. Yeah. These are different contexts. And so with the Gambia, what we have found was actually internally things are ripe for change. Now that change
Mm,
wasn't capitalized where we are now, but things
mm,
internally were ripe for change. The difference for the Gambia was they looked to ECOWAS for that guidance. And then the question then becomes to me, why is that Mali, Burkina Faso, and others in Niger are not looking to ECOWAS for that guidance?
mm,
Because young people wanted that change. But what
mm,
went wrong? What went wrong with the promise of democracy?
mm,
Why wasn't it working for those people? And until we understand that, we will never understand the reasons why those coup leaders are there where they are. So again, it's
mm,
about really trying to understand the local dynamics, the local needs, those
mm,
challenges and issues that
mm,
help us to pivot away from the sort of headlines, again, Wagner, Russia, or doomsday,
mm, mm,
to really understand deep down what went wrong. Because
mm,
I'm telling you, if you spoke to any of those people on the ground, they'll tell you there were so many other issues. They thought the market was going to promise them this, and it wasn't working for them.
mm,
And,
mm.
and that's what I mean about really understanding the root causes of these challenges. I mean, it's the stuff we teach in conflict resolution 1.1, but yet still nobody's doing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why there's a book we've just that contributed to that, so we've just published, and it's quite, we're looking at local dynamics and global connections, and how, and it was the idea of when we talk about globalization, or what was there's a localization. What was the
Mm,
concept that I was running through that edition? The point, like you just rightly mentioned, is, in a way, discarding local dynamics, local root causes, and then, just internationalizing those grievances without dealing with them at the root causes. But if we look at again, we look at Africa, the continent is very blessed. You look at DRCs, because so much resources, like Riley said, that we're not tapping into. You look at the side, look at all of these places, and there seems to just be, it seems to be one that is so much conflict. And then the overt focus on stabilization at the rather than focusing on what needs to be done. So I guess the question is, what is the, in terms of all of these other alternatives that we're seeing, the African led, all this new stuff, how do you project looking forward? So what is the future of, how do you see it? Let's say next 10 years, 20 years from now, what is going to be the future of security in DRC, in the Sahel, in this place, and in terms of the missions as well? What do you say
mm.
with these other new initiatives moving forward?
Well, I think we will see more versions of this. They will look very different from what we have now. I don't think all of them will be security, and I think the AU and other institutions are going through that learning curve that the UN in particular had in the 80s and late 80s, early 90s, particularly out of Yugoslavia and Rwanda and all those
Mm,
challenges. So I think these African-led peace support operations will go through an evolutionary approach, particularly where many of them might try to come under the AU as the
mm,
regional continental body. Others will adapt more of an adaptive stroke context specific approach. And we're seeing these adjustments, particularly with missions like the Accra Initiative trying to engage more with people, the
mm,
Rwandans in Mozambique, northern Mozambique, again trying to engage more with local communities. So I think these adjustments are taking place, but it will take time. So I think we
mm,
will see more of them. But I think what will definitely happen more of, particularly now in the era that we are in now, is one, I think there'll be more of a focus on preventative diplomacy going forward. And what do I mean by preventative diplomacy? More willingness to engage before a crisis emerges, more shuttle diplomacy, more use of special envoys, I think will take place, particularly from the AU side. Because again, the situation is becoming unbearable,
mm,
partly because you're seeing this fragmentation of the context, but also again more of these challenges emerging, which become difficult to deal with. So that's I think the first thing. The second aspect, as I said, more linked to wider aspects like elections, democracies. Now, there's been conversation about changing APSA and revising it and making it more modern. The reality is, in the context that we are now, to try and change that, there's no harmonization, no agreement, would be very difficult. So what I
mm,
suspect will happen is you will see more states or more individual groupings really holding individual states that go off track to those protocols and those agreements and really trying to narrow it and say, actually, no, this is the rules, this is what you signed up to. You are part of this club. You need to hold and respect that. So I think that is the move that we are likely, or should I say, we are more likely to see going forward. The other aspect that I think we will see is more UN AU partnerships. And I don't mean large peacekeeping operations, but what I mean is more UN engagement in terms of support offices that might
mm,
be that might be that might be built. You might see more UNDP engagement in terms of
mm,
more broader aspects. I know they've got work on climate, peace, and security, and in the
mm,
stabilization context. So I think this type of contractual exchange is likely to take place more because again, these are models that have been largely successful in places like the Lake Chad Basin, like the LGA, that
mm,
are working again with challenges, but are working in the right direction. So I think this is where we're more likely to see. The key for me here is ensuring that when these things are done, there is
mm,
strict coordination, strict agreements, and everybody's working together. Because the
mm,
moment everyone is trying to do everything in their own place, because of what they want and what their capitals want, then you end up in a challenge because again
mm,
everyone is then playing off one and each other. The focus is on trying to outrun your partner as opposed to
mm,
focus or working in the interest of the state or the people that it's supposed to serve. So I think for me that is the third dynamic that we're likely to see. A fourth thing I think we might see more localized conflicts, cross-border issues and challenges, because that's something
mm,
that I think we have largely ignored. But we might see more local peace agreements in that context. And what I mean by that is more
mm,
localized ceasefires, localized agreements that I think the AU and the UN can capitalize on to create those safe spaces. And I suspect that will be the way forward. How do we
mm,
enable these local communities, for example, in northwestern part of Nigeria, to be able to
mm,
hold or come together, form a peace agreement that the UN and the AU and regional bodies support. Now, for
mm,
me, that enables those actors to hold not just the AU, UN, and others accountable, but also to pressure locally those
mm,
groups that are in conflict to account. And so for me, that would be the model going forward. More localized ceasefires, more localized agreements, which really tap into the local and sort of capacity, but the local really what's the word? Not just the capacity, but the local skills and abilities that are there. And what
mm,
I'm trying
mm,
to sort of say is where you might have a local chief and a youth leader and a woman leader who's in that community serving in an unofficial role, we might see more of these sort of engagements. Partly because again, they are close to the context, partly because an institution like the AU is too far removed to be able to deal with that. And so for me, that's where I would be pivoting if I was in sort of this head road. That's why I see it's a trajectory. But again, I see it as where the AU and the UN in its partnership should be supported.
I agree. In my recent book, one of the and when I say it to people, I say it in the way to like is I said the future of Africa, and I'm glad you mentioned as well. It's like the youth, and you mentioned I said the youth and the women are the ones that are going to change it. And when I say it that way, you need to like look at from what you've said. That you talk about fintech, you talk about youth, innovative approaches that you could bring. You talk about using Senegal as a module to say, okay, that it can actually work if it's worked in Senegal. So you'd have the hope. And then again, we're looking at Nigeria as well. The last election, see how a lot of youths came out to for the first time to vote, and really had hope. So
And
so
I would add to that. I mean, Africa has the capacity. Let's be very honest. If everyone from Africa had really has the ability to be tapped into the way it should be, and we think away from just government structures, which is oftentimes a problem, and we think more private, allowing individuals to be able to run their own businesses. I mean, you only have to look to Nigeria as an example.
yeah,
The amount of business, I mean, any Nigerian that and I'm originally from Ghana, as you know, but any Nigerian will say, I'm running some sort of business.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
an entrepreneur spirit that can,
mm,
again, or you speak to a Somali person who, I mean, everybody has their own ways. And I think what
mm,
we're not doing is we're not tapping into that. What we're doing is, okay, government, making this big sort of state. When actually what we should be doing is investing into those people. That
mm,
woman at the marketplace who
mm,
is able to negotiate and get around and be able to say, okay, this person here owes this rent. All of those things are really crucial and important.
mm,
Why? Because they are the future economies that we need to build. It's not
mm,
just in the sort of state-run industry stuff. That is one aspect, but the other aspect that I think we so for whatever reason, and I think it's such a disheartening thing to hear and see, is we just trod on it like it's nothing. When actually the reality is, for most of us, it was that one woman in the marketplace who was part of the family who was selling stuff that they would
mm,
enable us to go to school
mm,
or
mm,
enabled the whole community to be able to go. And I mean, my grandparents, that example, my grandma would sell things in the market, do things, taking kids here, there, left, right, center, and the whole community knew my grandma. And even, what God rest her soul, I didn't see them, but, going to funerals or family events, you'd see this
mm,
picture of your granddad. But it created that sense of community, that sense of entrepreneur, and everyone
mm,
was able to contribute and to build the community together. And I think we've lost that. We need to move
mm,
back to some of that stuff because
mm.
why is that important? It's important because that's how we bring people back to what we're
Cohesion.
doing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that
I agree.
cohesion.
I agree with you, Andrew. And I think that, and I think to be honest, the more, and that's why I think it's important that the intellectuals also have a role to play in spotlighting these things and helping to creating a platform for this kind of like engagements to happen. But yeah, I agree with you 100%. We need to look inwards. We need to look at those micro level approach. There's always, and I think the UN is always is at that macro level, is at that supra kind of like stabilization effect, which I query. I disagree. Sometimes it's necessary for the short term. Like people say, you can't have development without peace, without argument. But in the long term, for sustainable development, it has to be the approach. Andrew, I'm really, really grateful to have you, join me today for this very insightful conversation. I really enjoyed your your beautiful insight into this issue, and like you started with a fair assessment, no criticism, fair, your objective, say where the UN has failed, say where it's it can do things better, where it has succeeded. Well, thank you for coming on today, and I look forward to speaking to you some other time, and we'll keep you posted once this is gonna air, and hopefully you help us share it among your network as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time as well.
All right, Andrew, you have a great day.
You too. Take care now.
Bye. Thank you once again for tuning in to this week's episode. As usual, join me to thank our guest, Dr. Andrew Tchie, for providing a very deep and useful insight into the UN missions in Africa. For now, stay blessed and I'll see you next week.